afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock in the east, 11 in the morning out west, Wednesday, and that means it's time for Freedom Watch, streaming live from the highly acclaimed strategy room at foxnews.com. I'm Judge Andrew Napolitano. We'll discuss the issues that profoundly affect your freedom, your civil liberties, your financial liberties, and your right to have a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. You made last week's session of Freedom Watch the most watched episode yet, and I thank you for all of your support. We continue this week with more of our exclusive investigation into the detainment of Steve Bierfeld by the TSA and the St. Louis Police Department at the St. Louis airport. The reaction to that story has been truly overwhelming. Steve joins us live later in the hour. The TSA responds to our investigation. Their reaction is coming up. And the ACLU, of all good folks, is now part of the story. They'll be here as well. We will also play the entire audio recording of Steve's detention at the St. Louis airport, which, of course, the police did not know he was making at the time he was recording it. You won't want to miss this. We encourage you to take part in today's show. Email us your questions to strategyroom@foxnews.com. You can also join the discussion by sending your tweets to Twitter/Judge Knapp. Doesn't that sound nice? Twitter/Judge Knapp. But first, it is my great personal pleasure to invite one of the world's youngest and most influential libertarian leaders to Freedom Watch. His fiery speech last month addressing Prime Minister Gordon Brown at the European Parliament electrified the world and put leaders everywhere on notice that there still is a free market. Daniel Hanon, who represents Southeast England for the Conservative Party, is a member of the European Parliament. He joins us now by telephone from Great Britain. Mr. Hanon, welcome to Freedom Watch.
It's a huge honor to be here. Thanks for having me on.
What did you think would be served by your marvelous and articulate defense of the free market, by your personal and poignant reminder to Prime Minister Brown that he was rejecting what we here in America call Economics 101, the basic rules and laws of the economic universe?
You know, I really like these tough searching questions. You know, they keep you on your toes. You can't get nice questions like that from the BBC, I tell you. I suppose I was trying to tell him what people in my constituency would have wanted to say if they'd been there. I don't know whether you have this in America. We certainly have it in Britain. But there is a kind of divergence between the political elites and everybody else. And the public are actually way ahead of the politicians on not wanting to spend money, not thinking that the state is the answer to everything, not wanting to get into debt. And I suppose what I was trying to achieve was to articulate the view of that unconsulted, ripped-off, lied-to, angry group of people who are having to pay for the whole thing and whose children will be having to pay for it down the years, but who, up until then, had really had very few articulators within the political class.
Well, you've become a hero to many, even on this side of the pond. Many, many, many libertarians, many of whom watch this show or download it online and watch it at another time, have asked us to have you on. They're thrilled to be able to listen to you answer my questions, and I'm thrilled, as I indicated, to be able to chat with you. Mr. Hanon, we have the same phenomenon here, where we have the political elites of both parties. Republicans and Democrats are equally as guilty of the big government mentality. You may recall that the first of these major bailouts here in the U.S. came under the supposedly compassionate conservative administration of George W. Bush. Now, President Obama has doled out or plans to dole out infinitely more money, but it was George Bush rejecting the Constitution and rejecting the free market that started all this.
That's the problem. That's the problem. You have a political class that is taking its advice from a very narrow group of people who, in the banking crisis, turned for advice to banking leaders who were not exactly disinterested and who, surprise, surprise, came out with a counsel that they should be subsidized by the taxpayer. I mean, I'm generally a big supporter of the Republican Party. In many ways, I'm a more uncomplicated supporter of the GOP than I am of my own party, being a libertarian. But I've got to say, the late Bush years saw the Republican Party drifting away from a lot of the core ideas that had once made it such a powerful electoral force. It had become a party of big spending, a party of federal deficit. It had become a party of external protectionism and steel tariffs. It was a party that was trampling over states' rights in a whole bunch of ways, ranging from the amendment on same-sex unions through to the way in which George Bush, after Hurricane Katrina, made it a federal issue rather than just saying, look, this has nothing to do with me, speak to the relevant authorities. And then, of course, as you rightly say, by the end, it had become a party of nationalizations and bailouts. And one of the things that I hope is going to happen now is that the Republican Party will use this period of opposition to good effect, to remember what it was that made it that brought it to such a triumphant success in the second half of the 20th century.
Well, there is...
That something else is
right,
the evolution of power.
Right. There is this phenomenon in this country, Mr. Hanon, that the party out of power, that is, the party not running the White House and not running the Congress, tends to return to its more traditional roots. But then as soon as it gets into power, goes right back to the big government nonsense that we have seen. My beef is with the collectivists. My beef is with those who think government is greater than the individual. My beef is with people who in the government don't respect the Constitution. As a judge, I spent more time hearing government lawyers argue ways to evade and avoid the Constitution rather than comply with it.
Yeah, and the people you're talking about are overwhelmingly employed by the state, and they are the ones who get their hands and fingers deep into the newly elected leaders. So we have this phenomenon. We have it much more badly than you do, because you've at least got a constitution that to some extent disperses power.
At least ours is written down.
Yeah, but I tell you, we are run, the British state now chiefly exists for the employment of its own employees. And I don't know if you guys have ever seen our TV show, Yes Minister. It was an absolutely brilliant description of how the elected minister becomes a vessel of the standing bureaucracy, the standing apparatus. And you know, the phenomenon that you just described of parties returning to their principles in opposition, but defaulting to the statist and bureaucratic status quo when they are in power, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens because they become encased in this massive state machine. Now, a lot of the ministers, a lot of the cabinet people, a lot of the legislators genuinely want to do things. They want to keep faith with their electorate. They want to do the things that they promised in opposition. But they find that they are within such a huge bureaucratic machine, it's become so inert that they simply can't change direction. They're pegging away at levers that have worked loose, they're jabbing at buttons that have been disconnected.
I also think that there's something about the concept of government that invites people into it, that seduces and attracts people who believe in using power to regulate the lives of others, that people, most respectfully, like you and I, usually don't end up in the government because we would be there to reduce it rather than expand it. And almost all of our colleagues, whether they're conservatives or labor, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, we have a few exceptions like Ron Paul, a person for whom you and I share a common admiration, but virtually all of our colleagues are there to write more laws, to gather more taxes, to regulate more behavior rather than less, and less.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, I mean, of course there is an element of that. The kind of person who wants to become a politician generally is somebody who believes in the power of the state to which he aspires to become a minister. Nonetheless, there's a bigger thing going on here, which is we don't see that, in fact, you have to be an elected politician before you perceive the extent of the problem. How difficult it is, with the best will in the world, for the elected person to change anything,
right,
given the vast vested interests of the standing civil service bureaucracies that have a stake in the status quo. And I didn't understand this before I was elected, and I think most of my voters don't really understand it. So we're in this weird situation where the elected guy has responsibility without power. He gets the blame for nothing changing, and it's not because he doesn't want to change, it's because he's become a prisoner of this huge machine. And I think you do not have this problem to the extent that we do, for two reasons. And maybe you live there and you can easily be blasé about how good your constitution is, but it does two things that are really unusual. One, most office holders are elected. You take for granted what the rest of the world doesn't have, that you elect the judge, you elect the sheriff, you elect the school board, you